Why do people walk away from faith and religion? Specifically, what has people reconsidering Christianity, or at least an American evangelical slice of Christianity? What are the reasons people are deconstructing? And what does it actually look like to be an exvangelical? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Welcome back to Theology on Air. We're so glad you guys are joining us. Theology on Air was born out of a ministry called Theology on Tap, where young adults all over Houston get together for craft beer and we talk about exciting, relevant, sometimes kind of controversial topics around philosophy and religion and the Bible and faith and culture. And in the podcast, we get to dive even more deeply into some of those topics. And so I'm excited to have you with us today. If you're listening on a podcast platform, of course, as always, subscribe and rate us, review us, all the things. We want you guys to hear all of what we offer because we think it's pretty good stuff. And I am Sarah Stone. I am one of the leadership team for Theology on Tap. I'm the outreach director for young adults at MDPC here in Houston. I am joined by Evan Frisk. Evan is a philosophy professor at Houston Community College. He's a big fan of theology, as some of you know. He simply loves the truth. Who puts that in their bio? Simply loves the truth. Okay.
I didn't write the whole thing.
Okay. And having become a dad, he's currently working at perfecting his extra corny dad jokes. I would just like to say that I think he already has perfected his dad jokes.
Do you know when they become dad jokes?
Oh boy.
It's when they become a parent.
Okay. And there we go. No, we're not doing that. And our very special guest today is Chris Harman. Chris is joining us from South Carolina. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about him in just a second, but he is an Exvangelical. We found a real live one to interview. He has a podcast called Redrawing the Bath, and I have, Evan and I have both listened to several episodes of that, so I'm really excited to hear from him. But just really quickly, let me tell you a little bit about these podcasts. Our next live event is August 10th. So if you're listening to this when it comes out, we would love to have you join us if you live in Houston. Otherwise, you can join us on Facebook Live. August 10th, the Theology on Tap topic is Exvangelicals. Why do some walk away? And we thought that it would be a good idea. We sort of learned this the hard way at our last live event, that we didn't all have the same definitions for things. And so we thought maybe this time, leading up to the event, we would host a series of podcasts where we would just explore, what are we talking about? So the first one talked about, well, what is evangelicalism? Because if people are going to walk away, we want to know what they're divorcing themselves from. The second one was about deconstruction. Where does that come from? What is it? That one tended to be a little bit more academic, but today's is going to be just the personal story of somebody that has walked away and maybe has walked partially back, and we'll get to hear Chris's story. So that's what we're about. And I think that's all the intro stuff we need to do. So I'm going to just tee it off. Chris, tell us a little bit about you and start to tell us the story of what it was like to become an exvangelical.
Yeah, no. Hey, friends, it's good to be here. I missed out on the craft beer, apparently. Didn't get that memo.
When you come to Houston, we will give you all of it.
You know, I for craft beer, I might have to. Shoot. I'm trying to think of where to even start. I became a Christian when I was 15. I'm 24, almost 25 now. So it's like 10 years of story. Mm-hmm. There are a few people that have really narrowed down their testimony, if you will, really well. I'm not one.
That's a churchy people. Word for us.
Yeah, that's a very churchy word. I'm not one of those people, so we'll see how this goes. So I became a Christian at 15. Had a youth pastor who I loved. To this day, we still keep in touch. I actually saw him yesterday. He surprised me and was in Charleston because he lives in Minneapolis now. But so heard the gospel from him, decided had what I genuinely believe to be a real encounter with Jesus. Was very voracious. I've always been a really big reader. So he had tons of books as a Bible college student, would go on to go to seminary, had tons of theology books. And I just kind of dug in and everything. Matt Chandler, Francis Chan. Back when Mark Driscoll was the thing. All of his
Uncanceled,
books.
yeah.
Yeah, canceled. Yeah, I was like, should I say that? I'm gonna say it because he was really big at that point.
I loved Mark Driscoll. I'm
yeah.
down. I still go back and listen to Mark Driscoll. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, I mean, he's a great preacher. I wish he was a great pastor, but he's, anyways, that's
Or now.
neither here nor there. But so I was raised in kind of a quasi reformed evangelicalism, but I don't think I had language for that at that point in my life. There was a lot of, I grew up in what some would probably call an unstable family life. A lot of that kind of came to bear later on in my adult life. But at that point in time, there was a lot of instability in the home as I was becoming a Christian, which actually, in a lot of ways, I'm very thankful for my evangelical upbringing because it gave me a home. It gave me a family, a place I felt safe and heard and seen. And so this youth pastor, about 2 years after he had been leading this ministry, felt God calling him to go to seminary to pursue further education. So he went, and the role was filled by someone who was much, much more reformed. So it went from kind of like Piper Chan adjacent to John MacArthur adjacent.
It's funny. I put Piper and MacArthur in the same camp, but you know what? That's another podcast for another day. Continue. They ratcheted up the reformedness. I got you.
Yeah. So they turned it up to 11 on that dial. I mean, we did the whole, I don't know if you're familiar with the curriculum that Grace produces, but the fundamentals of the faith is kind of their systematic introduction for new members. We did that probably like 2 or 3 times as a youth group. And so very like theologically dense material, because prior to that, I think I was probably 17 when I felt called into ministry. So from then on, I was very lucky to have a lot of people pouring into me, investing in me, introducing me to people, helping me to learn how to articulate myself. My dad's a lawyer too, so he's always been like, learn how to express yourself. But because of that, I spent my free time reading theology books, because I was just like, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I want to do. This is where I feel God calling me. So I'm going to do it. So by 18, 19, I was probably what you would consider a cage stage Calvinist. That was
So what does that mean?
So a cage stage Calvinist is it's basically that meme where there's the guy with the vein pulsating out in his head, where he wants to talk about being a vegan. That's a cage stage Calvinist. It's someone who cannot help but somehow bring his theology of predestination into any and every conversation.
Okay, so you were that guy.
Yeah, so I was that guy. I was really popular. Everyone really liked talking to me all the time.
You and I share that.
Oh yeah. That's funny.
But I was, after that, I went at around that time, I was accepted into a gap year program with a ministry called Hume Lake, called the Joshua Wilderness Institute. And that was really the first time in my life where I was introduced to a diversity of thought within theology. We had faculty who were egalitarian, and we had faculty who were affirming, and I had classmates that were charismatic. I mean, that was all around the time where the super reformed camp was like the spiritual gifts or the devil, and everyone was grabbing their pitchforks for Bethel, which still kind of, but not for
we're gonna be
that
talking about Bethel in an upcoming podcast. That's funny. Okay, continue.
But it was really the first time where I had seen diversity of theological opinion. And also because of some of the things that had happened earlier in my life, kind of coming to the forefront of my emotional, psychological experience, I was going through the ringer through that year. And these people that, I mean, to this day, I mean, I consider a lot of them family, really showed me a lot of love and compassion when there were days where I would just be in a bad mood, or I would lash out and yell at someone, and it was completely undeserved. And it really showed me that a diversity of thought could exist within one body, one unit, which it's like, you would think that that's kind of common knowledge, but until you see it, it takes seeing it to recognize like, oh yeah, this can actually happen. And so it opened my eyes a little bit past my ultra reformed fundamentalist mindset of like, well, these people have different opinions than me, and they love Jesus, And I couldn't disagree more with them, but they love me in ways that I feel like I couldn't love them with where
That's
I'm at.
interesting.
And so that kind of started shaking the ground a little bit. Another thing that really started shaking the ground was I read a book called The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. To this day, I wish I could just buy copies on copies to hand it out to my friends, because it's basically he was I want to say he was the chair of philosophy at the University of Southern California.
You should say that then, if that's what you want to say.
I think that's what it was. But it's it's kind of an exploration of the teachings of Jesus. And one of the main theses of the book is like when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is at hand, he's saying that the kingdom is coming, but he's also saying that the kingdom is here now. Like it's something for us to experience and live in now. And so, I mean, for probably a good third of the book, he spends it just exploring the Sermon on the Mount, and I'd never heard a sermon on the Sermon on the Mount up until that point. And I'm not going to say that no one ever taught a sermon on a church or a sermon on the Sermon on the Mount.
A lot of sermons there.
Yeah, a lot of sermons. But it was the first time where it made me pay attention, because this person was taking the teachings of Jesus and being like, okay, these are the ways that this applies now. And these are ways that you can bring this into your life. And these are some ways that you can experience the kingdom today. When it felt like a lot of my upbringing was the teachings of Jesus were kind of abstract, but like the words of Paul, like those are dogma.
Interesting.
And so that happened. And then I traveled a little bit, went to Israel, had some pretty intense experiences while I was in Israel. One of which, sitting at the Dome of the Rock, really made me rethink my thoughts on the end times and my thoughts on Israeli what's it called? Zionism, Christian Zionism, rapture theology, all that. So that it's weird because I can pinpoint a specific time when I started deconstructing, but as I look back on my life, there were a series of events that happened way before any of that stuff happened.
Yeah.
That really started shaking the ground. Where I was sitting at the Dome of the Rock, which is historically speaking where the temple would have stood if it hadn't been destroyed when the Romans destroyed it, or destroyed Jerusalem. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, if what I've believed for the last, I was 19, if what I've believed for the last 4-ish years is true, this building's going to be destroyed. The temple's going to be rebuilt. All these people around me are probably going to die in a horrible war. And because they're not Christians, they're going to go to hell. And I'm praying for that. Like that's something that I actively want. And obviously, like we can talk about Romans and all that good predestination, sovereignty stuff. But that was a really powerful experience for me, where I was just like, I don't know if I can actually believe this. And if there's anything better out there, please tell me.
Yeah.
So fast forward, went back home, got involved with the church. And if there's any way possible that they could have done it, they took that dial from 11 and turned it up to 24. So just
random,
borderline fundamentalist church. And I mean, I still have relationships with some of the people in that church. I love some of the people in that church. I have nothing bad to say about a lot of people in that church, but when I started moving to South Carolina, there were a series of events in my life that were at that point in my life, very important and very special. And there were people that made it very clear that their egos were more important than celebrating those moments with me and the people involved in them. And that was very traumatic for me, because I mean, like I said, I had a really unstable home life. And so for me, these people weren't just fellow church members. Like these people were literally spiritual parents to me. And so when time finally came to kind of sit down and try to work things out, it was just very one-sided, very we're going to kind of halfway apologize, but like God's sovereign over what we did, but what you did was wrong. And kind of brushing over the pain. And I mean, I don't like throwing around the word trauma, but I mean that what happened was traumatic.
Mhm.
And so that really led me down a road, that and a lot of other things. I think a lot of the racism I was seeing in the church context I grew up in, not necessarily blatant racism, but very just complacency to the racial issues
Mm.
in the country, in the world. Just a lot of not in disinterest in being active, and a lot of not being willing to speak out when people did things wrong. For instance, I mean, there was the whole statement a few years ago, social justice and the gospel, that
Yeah.
John MacArthur put out. And that for me was really a tipping point, because one of the main things in there, I can't remember the exact wording and I'm probably going to butcher it,
Mhm.
but the way I interpreted it was that John MacArthur was putting forward that living a life in the pursuit of justice was not necessary to be a Christian. And like we can get into the semantic woods of like, is that a gospel after effect? Is that the gospel? Like there's a lot of theological
Mhm.
discussion, but to me that looked like complacency, that looked like white supremacy, that looked like I didn't have that word in my vocabulary at that point, but I think now I would call it that. um but it was hard for me because I started looking at these people that I'd looked at as heroes for so long, and I was just like, I'm seeing the end fruit of their beliefs in their practice. Like the way that they're acting is informed by what they believe, and I
Mhm.
don't like the way that they're acting. And so if this is the end fruit of their beliefs, I don't want it.
Yeah.
And so from there I really started working my way back. But one of the things that I think probably separates me from some people in the exvangelical community is, I mean, I genuinely believed that I had a mystical encounter with Jesus. And so for me, it was always like, I am going to just work my way back to what Jesus taught in the gospels and just hold on to that and figure out what I believe around that. And so even to this day, I mean, I think it's Brian Zond said it really well. He's like, God is like Jesus. God has always been like Jesus. We didn't always know that. Now we do. And so I started just I literally for a year could only really read the gospels, and I couldn't, just because of a lot of my own issues and trauma from that past experience. I just couldn't really touch Paul. It was, or Paul or the other epistles. It was just really difficult. And so I kind of reworked everything working backwards of like, okay, I love Jesus. I trust Jesus. I think I'm following Jesus. I hope I'm following Jesus. Um, and from there, I got introduced to people like Brian Zond and Brad Jersak and
Mhm.
Thomas Ord. And well, what really started it was Rachel Held Evans for me.
Mhm.
Um,
I think a lot of people fall in that camp.
Yes. Well, I mean, I wasn't even aware of her until after she passed.
Mm.
And that was one of the things for me where I watched as people that I really respected were either celebrating the
Oof.
fact that she died, or were having to put an asterisk on their grief with
Yeah.
just a disclaimer. I didn't really agree with her, but like, this is really sad. And like, this woman left behind a husband, she left behind children,
Yeah.
she had a huge following of people that like would probably not call themselves Christians if it wasn't for this woman. Um, and that was really the moment. So for me, it was like I Googled Rachel Held Evans, and all these people that I respected at the time were like, don't listen to Rachel Held Evans. So what did I do? I went and listened to Rachel Held Evans.
Yeah. As
Um,
one does.
yeah, as
Yeah.
one does. And so I mean everything. And so that introduced me to the liturgists, and that introduced me
Mhm.
to Richard Rohr, and that introduced me
Mhm.
to a couple of other podcasts that I still listen to, and a few of them I'm really happy to call friends now.
Mhm.
But
When you've now had a lot of these people on your podcast, which is pretty impressive.
yeah, so that's actually, it's so funny because I started the podcast right around the beginning of COVID. And so it was it really was the best time to start a podcast because everyone was at home. And so you email someone who would usually be out on a book tour or like touring the
Yep.
country.
And they're
or
like,
whatever.
I'll do it.
They're
Yeah.
like, yeah, I got nothing else to do.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And so that was, I mean, it was amazing to me how many people were just like, yeah, sure, I'd love to. I mean, there was a morning where I emailed NT Wright and I was like, hey, I'd love to have you on the show. And I was like, he's probably going to take weeks to respond to this. 2 hours later, I get an email from him. He's like, hey, I'd love to do the show, but I just finished a book and I'm trying to spend more time with my family, but I will let you know if I'm free, which I still haven't had him on the show.
But you have an email from NT,
yeah,
right?
I have an email
That's
from
pretty
NT
cool.
Wright, which was just like, okay. So former Bible college Chris was freaking out.
Yeah.
And that was really why I started the podcast, was because I had questions for these people and I was like, I really want to ask them. And because of Dallas Willard, because of Richard Foster, who's another kind of contemplative, he wrote Celebration of Discipline, but because of people like that that had really informed my faith, the Redrawing the Bath originally, it's kind of taken on a life of its own, but it really was like this deconstruction process is so emotionally exhausting and it can feel so lonely and so scary and all that stuff. But if I could just be like, here are some like basic spiritual practices in light of the things that you're rethinking, like let's just focus on that. Like let's not like, I mean, that was a big thing for me, was like listening to open theists talk about intercessory prayer. I'm like, okay, but like what does that mean? Like how am I supposed to pray then? And so that was really what the show started out of, was I needed these questions answered of like, okay, my beliefs are shifting, but like what do I do? Like how does this affect my life in
And I want to
practicality?
say, I really appreciate about your podcast that you have people on there that are not always what you would expect someone that's an exvangelical post, like, the deconstruction process or in it, to have on there. I don't remember the name. There was one guy on there and you were like, you asked him at the end, like, so what if you changed your mind on? And the stuff he changed his mind on was like very minor. And like, he's basically, I think he believes everything that I believe. And I'm like squarely evangelical. Anyway, so I was like impressed by that. And you were like, yeah, okay. It was a friendly conversation. It wasn't like this guy, so I appreciate that. I have a question. When you've talked about deconstruction, and we talked about this at our last podcast, but I want to hear from you, somebody that's like just gone through it and it was very personal. How was the process of deconstruction different, or maybe it wasn't, from just doubt, right? Like you talked about, being in Israel and then, starting to have some doubt about maybe your end times theology, but it was like all these things that added together. Was it just doubt? Was it something different?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think doubt's I think it's an interesting word. I think Andy Mineo said it best when he said the opposite of faith isn't doubt. It's when I've got it all figured out. And so I think sometimes, at least for me personally, when I hear someone say doubt, it implies that something, or at least in my experience, this has just been my experience, but when people say that there's doubt, it's usually just because I'm asking questions. I don't want to say, well, sometimes people say doubt because they're afraid of people thinking critically, because I think that that's like so far off in the other end. But I think sometimes, like, I think Shane Claiborne says it really, really well when he says proximity changes everything. And so when you have these experiences, like when you have the experience that I had sitting at the Dome of the Rock, and there were so many other things that happened on that day, like dealing with like American nationalism and like internalized Islamophobia and like all these different things that like came out on that day. It was a very emotional day. My proximity to the end effects of a belief forced me into a position. It didn't force me. It put me in a position where I was like, I cannot reconcile this. So I think to doubt something, I think there was doubt. Like there was definitely doubt. But there was also a lot of rethinking things from the standpoint of, honestly, like this is not working for me. Like there are things in my brain that I cannot reconcile. And if there are beliefs within historic Christianity, not just evangelicalism, but I mean, one of the things I really try to do is like, I would really like to think that if you hold me up to any of the church councils, you're not going to find anything in my theology that doesn't align with Council of Nicaea, like Nicene
Mm.
Creed, Apostles' Creed. I would still pretty much align with those creeds. I mean, Westminster Confession, probably not. But at least
Probably
like
not the Chicago statement on
yeah,
yeah.
no. But it's a there is doubt involved, but I think sometimes for so many people deconstructing, and I don't want to speak for the whole community because it's so diverse in what it
Mhm.
looks like, but at least for me, there is doubt involved, and I'm totally fine with acknowledging that. Because I mean, I would, but I honestly like I would rather have some doubt than just kind of like blindly throw myself
Yeah.
at something and be like, oh, like yes, like this is totally fine. And so I think, yeah, there was doubt, but I think a lot of it was there were these things that I was seeing in the theology that I'd been raised in that I could no longer reconcile as good, healthy, or helpful in
Yeah.
my experience. And because of that, it kind of forced me out of evangelicalism to search the ecumenical world for different
Mhm.
opinions.
Yeah.
So on the same subject of doubt,
Uh-huh.
when you have way more experience in the evangelical world than I do. One of the things that I've just noticed though is that when people say belief, like there doesn't seem to be a difference between belief and knowledge.
Yeah.
And they kind of equate those. So when
Yeah.
you say like doubt seems to be kind of something that you could acknowledge and it doesn't bother you anymore.
Mhm.
Do you mean like the knowledge portion and you've just divided and maybe even rightly divided? Get my reference? I'm trying to
Yeah, we got it.
push some
Rightly divided.
reformed
Yeah.
things. Okay, so like just rightly divided this idea of like what do you believe and what do you know ends up being
Mhm.
kind of in
Hmm.
different categories. Is
Mhm.
that part of the deconstruction that you've gone through? Is breaking that barrier down?
Yeah, I think that's a huge barrier to break down of I think especially, I mean, you Hebrews, like faith, I'm gonna butcher it because I can never remember the exact wording, but faith is the essence of things hoped for, and I think it's the presence of things not seen. Is that the word? I think it's
I'd butcher
Hebrews
it as well.
11.
It's close enough.
It's good enough for us to keep talking about. How about that?
But like and that's really the thing of like I mean, I used to be really into apologetics. Like I mean, I grew up way the master, do you think you're a good person? Like, and that's kind of but like I really do like philosophy. I love apologetics. So like I know that there are good arguments as to why the Bible is at least a historically important document. I know that there are good arguments for Jesus being an actual person that existed. But I think to say wholesale, like, yes, I know for a fact that this person rose from the dead. Like, I think that man, I'm putting myself in hot water here. But like, I think
I was about to ask that
This is-
question though.
This is kind of why I asked it as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll be honest, like there are days where I don't believe it. I don't believe it in my thought, and I don't believe it in my action. I mean, there's a philosopher named Peter Rollins who one time he was asked, "Do you deny the resurrection?" He said, "Yes, I deny the resurrection every time I don't love my neighbor. I
Mhm.
deny the resurrection every time I don't have hope. I deny the resurrection every time I do something unjust." I think that there's a lot of ways that we don't have faith, or I think there's a lot of things that we don't know, but I don't necessarily think that the Bible calls us to knowledge. I think that the Bible calls us to faith. Or I mean, I think Jesus calls us to faith. Like, leave the Bible out of it. Um, I think Jesus calls us to faith. And I think when you look at Hebrews, when the author of Hebrews says it's the essence of things hoped for and the presence of things not seen, it shows that like, yeah, like there are going to be moments where these things are abstract. Like these things don't make sense. And these things, I mean, you might walk out into dangerous water. There might be days where you're like, like the idea that someone 2000 years ago, like died on a cross and rose from the dead 3 days later, and now he's in heaven, which is another completely abstract idea.
Yeah.
Prepare, like some days it's like, yeah, like that's kind of ridiculous. But in my heart of
Oh,
hearts,
it is ridiculous.
yeah,
Everyone agrees that.
yeah, but I believe it.
But
Like,
believable is different than
I mean, I wholeheartedly believe it. Like, if like gun to my head, I'm like, yeah, I believe in a resurrection. I'm not I'm not factually convinced of a resurrection, but I
Hmm.
believe it. Like I'm very much like convicted that I do think that Jesus rose from the dead.
So,
And
and then looking at American evangelicalism in particular, do you think that they make that distinction of like, no, you must know it? And
Oh,
do they
interesting.
push that as a kind of like pietism almost?
yes, oh, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
I think the Ark exhibit is a perfect example of like
Okay.
what they're doing in, I think it's Kentucky.
Of
But
course
just
it's
the idea
Kentucky.
that, I
No, it
mean,
is Kentucky.
It's,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
yeah, it
Kentucky.
is Kentucky, but just stuff like that where it's there is no distinction between knowledge and faith. Like faith is what you know. It's not what you believe in. Um and I don't know what to do with that. That's way above my pay grade. But I do think that that was something that I was really disgruntled by, was the amount of things that I was told I had to believe, but that I also had to know. Like I think one big one is old earth creationism of
Mhm.
like or old earth versus new earth. Like I definitely lean more towards old earth creationism now. Um and I for a really long time I just didn't care because I was like, this is
Mhm.
just so not what this is about. But I think now I'm in a place where I'm like, yeah, I trust science. And I think it was Galileo who said something along the lines of, if, oh, what did he say? It's like the Bible talks about the stars, but it can't name them and tell you where they are.
Mhm.
Um,
It
and because
doesn't.
like,
Yeah.
and so he makes a bunch of scientific points and he says, if science comes to a conclusion that doesn't agree with scripture, understanding that scripture, while still important, doesn't necessarily teach us everything about everything,
Yeah.
we might need to interpret scripture differently. And so I think that's one of the things of faith, is when you come to a point where you're like, I'm seeing these things in the world and I've been taught this my whole life, but it's not making sense anymore. So maybe I need to step out in faith and look at these other ways to view this thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think evangelicalism is very good at that. And if I dare say, I think one of the telling points of that is you look at where Christian academia is going. And I mean, we can talk about liberal agenda and all that stuff, but I think we're discovering new things about history, about archaeology, about context every day. And so the academia is pointing in a specific direction, and we still have conservative evangelical churches that are still holding to things while academics are saying, no, we shouldn't hold to this. I mean, N.T. Wright's New Perspective, I mean, John Piper literally said you don't need to understand the historical context to interpret the Bible accurately in his
Hmm.
argument against N.T. Wright. And so you have evangelical pastors doubling down, and that's a whole tangent. But to answer your question, I do not think that the evangelical church is good at differentiating faith from knowledge.
Yeah. I want to move us into like two big sort of chunks of conversation. One is reasons why people deconstruct.
Mhm.
And then the next is, how does reconstruction work?
Yeah.
And then we're going to get into some juicy stuff. And so this doesn't have to be like rapid fire, but I don't want to conquer each of these things. But I'm wondering if you could sort of maybe help us with our list. I have an ongoing list of reasons why it seems like people start the deconstruction process. I sort of made up this term in the last podcast, like the exit ramps of from evangelicalism. And I've made this list only by listening to podcasts like, your podcast, The Deconstructionist, My Favorite Heretics, like various Rob Bell, and talking to people that are ex-evangelicals. And so you mentioned a few things. You mentioned like, your eschatology was called into question. That's like how we view end time stuff. You mentioned like racism and social issues that you felt like your church was being complacent on or quiet about. And then just kind of Christians being jerks, which by the way, we do have a question on Facebook that I want to maybe end with, which is about how you now feel about the people that were ugly to you.
Yeah.
But we'll get that there later. So if those are a couple of your exit ramps, what do you think for those that you've talked to, if you had to say like, I don't know, just pepper us with like 5, 6, 10 things that you think cause people to go? And you just mentioned another one with the evolution thing, or with the creation and how old the earth is. Because again, I think everybody in this conversation would say that is not a fundamental issue that should cause somebody, right, to walk away from whether they believe Jesus rose from the dead. It's like, I firmly believe there will be people in heaven that are, helping build the museum in Kentucky and 6-day all the way to the people that are theistic evolutionists. And one of them is probably wrong. That's how these things work. But what would you say some of those other like exit ramps are?
Oh man. Yeah, I think science in general is a big one. Sexuality is a big one.
Ooh, yeah.
Racism is a big one. How to interpret the Bible is a really big one.
Now, see, I would maintain, and this is what I want to get into when we talk about reconstruction. The Bible one may be kind of the overarching one.
Yes.
I'm curious your thoughts on that, but later. And when you say sexuality, you mean like the LGBTQ conversation?
Yes. I think purity culture, I think patriarchy, like all of it. I think that's why intersectionality is so important, because there's so many different layers of conversation that need to happen.
And then when you said science, you mean the ways that science seems to kind of throw a monkey wrench in certain evangelical beliefs?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm like literally writing this down as you talk, because this is what our next event is about. And so far, these are all on my list. So I'm very proud of myself.
Okay, good.
I, by the way, also have Calvinism on the list.
Yeah, that's a
surprising number of people have talked about meeting the militant Calvinists. No one mentioned your name specifically, but
people just like they learn what Calvinism is and they immediately start deconstructing. Like,
no.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, they were predestined to deconstruct, don't you know?
Yeah, children.
No, they meet buttholes who are jerks about it.
Yeah.
And then, or they get the message that like, and I don't think a good Calvinist would say this, but they get the message that like God has made people to send to hell. God wants to and is delighted to send people to hell. We're not going to dive into that topic, but I think that's probably one that makes the list. Yeah.
That's way above my pay grade. I mean, I don't,
We'll get John MacArthur on here. He's probably not doing much because of the pandemic. And
well, he's doing, I mean, if you ask me, he's doing too much since the pandemic.
He's doing the most.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to think of other ones. I think Christians being jerks is a really big one. I mean, the Trump election was a massive thing for a lot of people. I mean, that was a whole interesting time period for a lot of people. I think a lot of people were really hurt by that.
I feel like a lot of the deconstruction podcasts I listened to started in 2016. No lie. It's like, there's trouble in the water. We gotta, respond to this.
Just specifically because I have a shared experience there with this one. What exactly do you think in the Trump nomination and Trump election do you think got people thinking about religion, about their place within their church?
I think it was just the unabashed backing of Trump that was really disorienting for people. I mean, I think it was Franklin Graham, or was it Franklin Graham? It might've been Franklin Graham when Bill Clinton was caught with Monica Lewinsky, was talking about we need a president with moral standards. And then when everything came out with Trump's comments about grabbing women, he was like, I'm not, it's locker room talk. He's a president. And so I think that there was just a lot of cognitive dissonance. There was a lot of, and that's not me saying I don't have any cognitive dissonance. That's just me saying there seemed to be a weird kind of, and it's one thing to be like, I mean, I have relatives. My dad voted for Trump and he was like, I didn't know what else to do. Like, I didn't necessarily like him, but that's who I felt like was the better choice. And that's one thing, but to have someone be like, this is God's person. He's going to end abortion. He's going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. He's going to build the wall. And that's a whole other conversation to be had. But I think just the unwavering loyalty up until January 6th was really hard for a lot of people to see, that we're like, we're supposed to love Jesus. And in my opinion, like, this person doesn't look anything like Jesus.
But he's an evangelical. I'm joking. I'm just saying he said that. I am not here to talk about Trump. Lord help me.
Yeah, we might have to.
I do have Trumpism on my list. I feel like I have a bingo card right now and I'm like winning with these. But yeah.
I think a big one, and it's really tough because I feel like this doesn't describe every evangelical church, but I think it describes a lot of evangelical churches, or at least in my experience talking with other ex-evangelicals, where people started rethinking their beliefs and it was made very clear that there wasn't space for them. Like the
Hmm.
church body couldn't hold space for that.
Hmm. Couldn't hold space for the conversation, or couldn't hold space for somebody arriving somewhere that maybe went sideways from like the creeds, like you talked about. Is it about the actual beliefs, or is it about like questioning?
I think it's about questioning. I mean, I think
Yikes.
to an extent, like I heard it. I mean, I was going to a Southern Baptist church when I started deconstructing, and
Mhm.
I heard it and it was never said. And I hold literally, like, I have nothing bad to say about anyone that went to this church. I still really love a lot of people that went to that church.
Yeah.
Or that go to that church. But it was very clear that it was like, we respect your questioning, but just make sure that you come back to the answers that we have. And I think for some people, like I said, because of experiences or trauma or that's another one is suffering. Like, I think things happen in people's lives and they start questioning things. But because of certain events, the beliefs that they held are impossible to reconcile, or at least in their current
Seemingly
emotional
impossible.
state,
Yeah.
or seem impossible to reconcile. And to not create, I think to not create space for that is wrong. I think that there would be people that disagree with me, and that's fine. But yeah, I think those are like the big ones that I can think of: Trumpism, science, sexuality, racism, and kind of the inability to hold that tension.
Let me ask you about another one that I heard a lot. And it maybe will actually take us into how we view the Bible and Reconstruction, is this idea of like original sin. So some people talk about it with that term, like original sin. How could we believe, in a God that would like sort of allow that to be a thing? But then also it seemed like right alongside that was kind of the messaging that people have gotten from the church that if you fill in the blank, you're going to hell. And so maybe it's like if you have sex, or if you drink alcohol, or if you question or whatever. And of course, the Bible doesn't actually say any of those things, right? Like God made sex, he made alcohol, Jesus loved wine. But the messaging is you have a problem. One of your guests, I can't remember who, that's probably best, said something like, the message that I got was that I'm not good enough. And of course, as a somewhat reformed, squarely evangelical person, I thought, but that's true, that we're quote not good enough. But it's not because like you're such a terrible, worm of a person. It's that we can never be holy like God. And so that's why, you bridge that with Jesus. So what do you think about that? The whole like original sin, that we have a problem, that we have sort of the chasm between us and God created by sin. Would you say you've kind of jettisoned that?
I think Richard Rohr says it really well of we talk about original sin without talking about original blessing. Like, I think that we really, we overemphasize, I think sometimes we overemphasize the point that like, yes, like we are imperfect, and yes, like we do sin and we do fall short and we miss the mark. Which I actually would prefer that definition of sin, of missing the mark and not necessarily being everything that you can be through Jesus. But it's, at least in my experience and the experience of other ex-evangelicals I've talked to, it seems like a lot of people were put in a position where original sin was almost weaponized, in the sense that like, I mean, that was a big one. Like, when you start asking questions like, well, the heart is deceitful, it's like, okay, but like the law of the Lord is also written on my heart, so like, which is it then? Like, where do I go? And so for people with original sin, people like to talk about original sin, and I feel like in my own personal experience, people like to talk about original sin to escape the consequences of what they've done. That was something that I saw time and time again in my very conservative upbringing portion of my life, was people are like, yeah, like I really did this thing, or even the event that kind of led to my deconstruction. Like, yeah, I really hurt you and the people that were immediately around you at this time, but like we're all fallen. So like, what can you do really at the end of the day? And so I think original sin is sometimes weapon. I have no problem with acknowledging that people have a sin, like a sin problem. I think my definitions of what is sin and isn't sin have kind of changed over the years, but I think I have no problem acknowledging that people aren't perfect and that they do hurt each other. But I think that the concept or the doctrine of original sin in a lot of contexts where people find themselves deconstructing from it has been utilized to either discard their pain or silence their questions.
Yeah. No, I hear you on that. That's really interesting. And I don't have a real dog in the fight for like original sin, but sin, I guess to me, the question always ends up getting to, so do you think we need a savior? Do you think we need Jesus? And I think maybe that's one of the areas where at least some of your guests, I don't know where you stand on this, but some of your guests, I think would say, thanks be to God that we have Jesus. He's this amazing example. He came to show us how much the Lord loves us and wants to heal us, but that we might not need him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't put any of these in the show notes, and I'm sorry that I'm just hitting you with it off the cuff, but feel free to respond to that if you want, but if not, we can go to the next thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, that gets into atonement and all, like that's a whole,
which is another penal substitutionary atonement's on my list too.
Podcast. Yeah, that's another big one. I mean, I think N.T. Wright says it really well of like, if by penal substitutionary atonement, you mean that there is a penalty for sin being death and that Jesus died because of sin and somehow God used it to atone for that and make things right, then yeah, absolutely. I believe in penal substitutionary atonement. Or PSA, I'll say that. But but he followed it up with the caveat of, I think a lot of Christians have forgotten what John 3:16 says, where it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, and turned it into for God so hated the world that he killed his only son. And so, I mean, I'm a huge N.T. Wright fan, but he that's something that really sticks out to me. So do I think we need Jesus? Yes, I think we need Jesus because he showed us a way to live that is better than literally. I mean, things weren't going too hot before Jesus showed up on the scene, you know? I mean, there's a patristic scholar named Brad Jersak, who I had him on the show, and I mean, I probably would not be a Christian if it wasn't for this guy. But he's a universalist, or he's a hopeful universalist. I would consider myself in that camp as well. But I asked him the question, like, if we're all going to heaven, what's the point of Jesus? And he's like, have you not met Jesus? Like, have you not encountered this living God? And he's convinced, I'm convinced, regardless of what happens, like, we needed Jesus to die. I mean, we needed Jesus to die, maybe not necessarily to satisfy his own wrath, but even for the harrowing of Hades, which is a whole other conversation. But I do think that Jesus needed to come. I think Jesus needed to come. I think that he needed to live and serve and minister and teach and show us a way to live that was countercultural and subversive to power in a self-giving and co-suffering way, that was not violent, that was not hateful, that was, to use Rene Girard, to stop the consistent scapegoating of people. And
just to be clear, when I say need Jesus, I don't mean we sure are lucky he came. I mean, he's the only hope that we have for salvation. And I think, but I mean, I love everything you're saying. I think it's beautiful. And I think for people, it's sort of my camp. I think we've tended to make it this narrow slice of you need Jesus to get out of hell, which you do, but also there are all of the things that you just listed that are sort of these, like, they're really blessings and gifts that we haven't explored. But I know you're dying to say something, right? I can feel the itch from here.
I've got at least a little bit. So this is one of the questions that I also had while listening to the podcast. It was one of the guests. It wasn't you that said that we deserve salvation. or something to that
Ooh,
extent. And it was
interesting.
because I'm a philosopher and I get way too picky about wording, that
Yeah.
the fact that we deserve it bothered me a lot because of what I think grace is.
Mhm.
If grace
if you
is,
deserve it, then it's
it's
not grace.
unmerited
It's not
favor.
grace. Yeah.
Yeah. Then now we're no longer saved by grace. And in fact, like God is required to do these things. They're not really gifts. And it totally would change the way that I would view not only humanity, but also God in really radical ways that I just wanted to know, like, if for salvation in particular, is this something that we deserve, or is this kind of just like an overflowing of mercy from God?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I'm gonna have to find that interview. Like, that's one of the fun things about having a podcast is every once in a while people will say things and you're like, okay, like, I don't know how I feel about that, but let's keep going. But I think, deserved that's a difficult word, and I would definitely not use that word. But to continue using that word, I think that we deserve salvation in the same way that the younger son in the prodigal son narrative deserved the party that the father threw for him, not because he actually deserved it, but because that's what the father wanted to do for him.
Okay.
Preach.
Which, like, that's not really deserving. That is grace. But I think, I would not use deserving.
But it's like built into the relationship.
But it is
Yeah.
the nature of the father to want to
Yes.
lavish his love on the son.
Yeah.
And so are we does the father think that we're deserving? I mean, if he made that decision, then yes, but are we in our own existence deserving? No. Like, probably not. So I don't know. Like, that would be my answer. That's
a good answer. I like that answer. I approve of that answer.
Okay, good.
I want to talk, the time is going so quickly. I want to talk a little bit about reconstruction.
Yes.
And I find it interesting that you said, in our last guest is something similar, but very clearly said for a while, all you could read was the Gospels. So one, I'm surprised that you were still reading the Gospels, because I think some people are like, well, I'm not going to read any of the Bible. The Bible's, I can't trust the Bible right now. So I'm curious why you chose to keep one foot in, and maybe it's because of the mystical experience you had with Jesus, but for you, what did reconstruction look like? And then just, what do you think that tends to look like for people, or maybe what should it look like for people?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of different ways that you can gather information, right? Like, I could go to Google, I could ask various people what they think. Of course, I'm going to always say that I think the number one source to figure out what's true about things is to go back to scripture. But then some people are like, well, I can't trust scripture. So talk a little bit about reconstruction. What does that look like?
Yes. And that really was one of the reasons I really held on to the gospel was, I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine the other day about universalism. He's like, why are you a universalist? Like, if you're a universalist, what's the point of following Jesus? I'm like, because I love Jesus. Like, not only do I believe that he, like, is the key to my salvation, but I also believe that, like, he came and lived a life that is compelling and worth embodying in my own life. And so that was why I really held to the words of Jesus. But I think for me, that, and for honestly, I feel like a lot of deconstruction thought leaders is really the cornerstone that you have to start with. I mean, you look at Brian Zahnd, you look at Bruxy Cavey, Brad Jersak, people that have done work on the characteristics of God and mainly embodied in Jesus. Brad Jersak has written, I think, 3 books on it, where it starts out a more Christ-like God, a more Christ-like way, and a more Christ-like word. And so he's very Christocentric in what the study that he's doing right now. But I would say that, like, Jesus, to reconstruct and maintain Christianity, the cornerstone has to be Jesus. Like, because at the end of the day, if you can be compelled by Jesus, you can think, yeah, he's a really cool teacher. Like, I mean, it goes back to the C.S. Lewis liar, lunatic, or Lord
right
thing.
Those are your options. Yeah,
you can be compelled by him, but if he's not God, then, like, that's kind of what Christianity is all about.
Okay, I have to pause you for a second, because part of this conversation strikes me that maybe you're not a very good exvangelical. I'm joking. But when we had the Dr. Wacker came on in the first of these podcasts, and he kind of listed out what an evangelical is, not what is American evangelical in sort of the like feel and ethos of it, but what are like the sort of hallmarks and distinctives. And it sounds to me like you still align with those, like that Jesus is your savior, that there's, I mean, everything you know about Jesus, you know, from scripture. So there's some sort of appealing to scripture as being at least trustworthy. You know, you had a personal conversion, there's a moral and ethical concern and a sense of mission. Those were the 5 he said. So maybe help me understand how you've landed on the term exvangelical, because you sound a little closer than I thought you were going to.
Yeah. I think it's William Paul Young says it really well.
Is that the Shack guy?
Yeah, that's the Shack.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he's awesome. I love him a lot. But he says it consistently, and I mean, he identifies as an exvangelical, but he's like, these are my people. Like, I don't identify with this institution at large, but these are my people. Or even a pastor friend of mine from LA that I was talking to a few weeks ago, we were talking and he was like, Chris, you live in Charleston, South Carolina, but you're from Southern California. Like, that's going to be in your blood till the day you die. And he's like, and you can't deny that. You shouldn't be ashamed of that. You shouldn't be embarrassed of that. You shouldn't. There's some things like the fact that I have really bad road rage. That's like, yeah, I'm from California. Like, what are you going to do? Or like the fact that I call all of the interstates out there highways or freeways, or the fact that I refer to the major freeways as the 101 or the 1 or the 405 or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, there are things about being from California that's like, that's not going to translate other places. But I'm still from California. And even though I would identify as exvangelical because I've moved out of the evangelical community, my roots are still in evangelicalism. Like, that's still where I learned about Jesus. That's still where I learned how to study the Bible. That's still where I learned how to function in a church community. I mean, it's funny because I tell people all the time, because they're like, you must have been using a bad translation. Like, no, I came to my conclusions on salvation, on sexuality, on gender roles. Like, I was using a John MacArthur study Bible.
Oh, snap. Only study Bible to be named after a person.
Well,
that's a conversation for another day. And I'm sorry that I've sort of derailed you from the question. I'm maybe not the biggest John MacArthur fan, but and I do want to get back to Reconstruction. And I'm joking when I say you're a bad exvangelical. I'm noticing a lot of things that I think, well, that sounds like what I believe. You know, I mean, I think probably you would land more progressive on some issues, but there's evangelicals that land progressively. So, but continue about Reconstruction, because time is quickly escaping.
So Reconstruction, I would say Reconstruction looks different. I will caveat it with this. Reconstruction looks different for everyone, and I would never prescribe a way to reconstruct your worldview, particularly if there has been some form of spiritual abuse. I think especially if, like, as time goes on and we are seeing the psychological ramifications of spiritual abuse. I mean, even like this Who Killed Mars Hill podcast, or the work that Dan Koch's doing on You Have Permission. Like, there are people that are doing work to understand the psychological ramifications of pastoral abuse, whether that be physical, emotional, sexual, like these things. It's all abuse, but the spiritual aspect of it adds tiers to it.
Yeah, of course it does.
It adds levels of, like, this is the person that I feel like God has anointed and entrusted. Like, this is, to put it very archaically, like, this is the face of God to me. Yeah. Like, this is the person who gets up on the stage, represents what God has to say, what he wants for me. And so for me, I have friends that have faced horrible abuse in the church. And I would never, ever, ever in a million years tell them, because you're not starting with Jesus at your Reconstruction, you're doing it wrong. I think for everyone, it looks different. And I would also like to acknowledge that as a straight white man, like, I also have a lot of privilege in a lot of areas in my life where, like, I wasn't discriminated against for being a member of the LGBTQ community. Space was made for me for being straight. Space was made for me for being a man. Space was made for me for being white. So there's levels of intersectional discrimination and trauma that I'll never understand. So it is a lot easier for me to walk into spaces that I once walked, while still also feeling like there isn't really a space for me in evangelical churches. Let alone to be, I don't know if I want to be a pastor anymore, but to, like, be a pastor in an evangelical church, I mean, I couldn't get up on a Sunday morning and be like, yeah, anyone that doesn't hear the gospel is going to hell. Like, I can't betray my conscience like that.
Yeah.
And
Okay. So, but for you, reconstruction looked like focusing on Jesus and then letting the other sort of building blocks come after that.
Yeah. So I think that was really what started it. Was, I think Jesus is the cornerstone, and it's, if I can find theological ideas that I can reconcile with the things that I'm experiencing, the people I'm encountering, the ways in which I feel like these fruits are being developed that are within the Christian tradition and don't escape the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, I think I'm doing okay. And so I think one of the things, I mean, a lot of things, like my opinions on affirming and inclusive theology, my opinions on women being pastors, I don't really see any of these things coming up against at least the major creeds. I mean, maybe like you said, Chicago Statement of Inerrancy or Nashville Statement of Sexuality, but those aren't councils. Like, those are people that all agreed with each other already, saying this is where we want to die. Like, this is the hill we want to die on, which is, I mean, that was, I'll say this, the Nashville Statement, which was the one on sexuality, when you have Preston Sprinkle, who is probably one of the most prolific scholars in that field, who still holds to a non-affirming traditional view, saying this is bad, like, that's not good. This is not a good thing. And so for me, it's like, you can bring up these statements, but it's like, yeah, but these aren't creeds. Like, the church fathers didn't come together and agree on the Nashville Statement. Like, Athanasius of Alexandria did not sign off on the Chicago Statement. So I think I'm doing okay. And so I think that was really what it was I was like, I felt like I had freedom. I feel like I have freedom to explore different theological ideas outside of the evangelical framework. But for me, it's, I mean, the most important thing is Jesus, but if I can find things that fit into the creeds, I'm going to stick with those things. But that's probably because I lean a lot towards patristic scholars and theology and that stuff.
So we're technically out of time, but I want to ask if Evan I have one last question. It's actually something that could be a whole podcast, but I'm gonna make you do it in like 30 seconds. Okay. But do you have a last question you wanted to throw out?
No, I've loved the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, good. Well, then I get two. Okay. So I had on here, and I meant to ask our last guest, although, well, anyway, I had a question on here. Are Exvangelicals still Christians? Now, you have multiple times called yourself a Christian, so I already know the answer that you would say is yes, they can be. So my question is, how would you define what a Christian is in like a very succinct, couple sentences? What is a Christian? I'm like very curious how close your idea would be to maybe mine or Evan's.
Well, bare bones, it's someone who proclaims that Jesus is Lord. Like that.
All right.
That's the definition of a Christian, like.
That's amazing. That was way less than 2 sentences. That was like, bam.
Now I've thought of a question.
Okay, cool. So,
specifically, I know and have experienced a lot of the vices of evangelicalism. What are the vices that you see of the Exvangelicals? Things that fellow Exvangelicals should avoid?
That's a really good question.
Ooh. Yeah. No, I feel like I have this conversation very frequently. I think, to put it very succinctly, philosopher René Girard talked about scapegoat mechanisms, how we consistently just other each other into oblivion. Like, we always need someone to hate. And Peter Rollins once said, if the Nazis had succeeded in the final solution, they would have started killing each other, because the entire system was founded on finding someone to punish and blame. And my big fear, and I see this a lot for the progressive Exvangelical deconstruction community, particularly those that are still trying to maintain some semblance of Christian faith, is that they are just going to become the opposite of everything that pushed them out of evangelicalism. Of, oh, you don't believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, get out, to like, oh, you don't believe that the earth is 3.4 billion years old, get out. Or like, and like, there's layers to that, because there's issues of oppression, there's issues of systemic racism, there's issues of like, we cannot hold space for these things, but at the same time, like, we also can't label everything as abuse or trauma. Mainly being people disagreeing over tertiary issues, not necessarily issues that are intrinsically harmful to other people.
That othering is, I mean, that's just good for everybody to remember. So that's good. I like it. All right. So the question that came in on Facebook, I thought would be a great way to close us out. This person says, the question for you is, does he understand / forgive the fundamentalists who are mean to him? That is, that the fundamentalists think they are defending something important and see their own anger as essential. Fun fact, this question comes from one of our friendliest atheist listeners. So he's an atheist asking the Exvangelical, does he understand / forgive the fundamentalists that were ugly to you back in the beginning of your deconstruction?
Yeah. I think during the beginning of my deconstruction, I don't want to get, I want to be, because I was moving around a lot during that deconstruction. I want to be very clear. Those people, it was not over issues of theology. It was a very personal, it was a very personal attack on me and people that at that time I very deeply cared about. And so I don't, I mean, to this day, I really don't have very many fundamentalists being mean to me, because any fundamentalist that knows me knows that they're probably not going to change my mind. So they don't even, there's like, whatever, Chris is just going to think what he's going to think. It's accurate. But if there have been any, like, yeah, like I wholeheartedly understand it. And I do forgive. I think the personal issues were much more difficult to forgive than the other ones, specifically because these people never, at least I don't think that these people ever actually like sought out reconciliation, because I think reconciliation demands honesty and truth telling, and there was none of that.
Yeah.
It was very fake and disingenuous.
Really sad.
But for my fundamentalist friends that I still have, I mean, I think that was one of the things for me leaving a more conservative church context, was I felt like space wasn't going to be able to be held for me. But for me, it's like, I want to hold that space. Like for my fundamentalist friends, like, you think the earth is 6,000 years old? Cool. Like, let's grab a beer. Like you think that the Bible is inerrant? Let's go to the beach. Like, I think that there are issues for me where in regards to race and sexuality and gender, where it's, I'm still trying to navigate how to engage with people that don't align with my ideology, especially systemic racism. And I want to be an advocate for the LGBTQ community, but I also understand that like there are a lot of Christians, especially coming into contexts like Parkside, that are still
that's the church that he goes to. Nobody here is going to know what Parkside is.
So Parkside's a small Presbyterian church in Charleston, but there are some evangelicals there that still hold to a traditional view of marriage.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest and say that I'm still trying to figure out how to hold space for that, because as someone who is affirming, I do view non-affirming theology as intrinsically harmful to LGBTQ people. And so it's hard for me to hold space for people that I believe are actively hurting other people, or not actively, but by their beliefs hurting other people.
Yeah.
So that's difficult. But I also believe that like I don't think that I love perfectly. I don't think that I hold space perfectly. And I really do hope that in the end, like whatever, it's going to work out.
It's going to get sorted. Yeah.
But to answer the question, yes, like I do forgive those people. It took me a really long time. It's a therapy. It's a deconstruction. But yes, I do forgive those people.
Yeah. Oh man, so much good stuff. And I really kind of wish we could pick your brain for many more minutes, but our time is up. So how about this? If people are interested in his podcast, it's called Redrawing the Bath. I've really enjoyed it, even though many of your guests I probably disagree with. It's been really interesting to listen to. But tell people where they can find you if they want to engage with you more. How can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook, Chris Harman. Feel free to add me as a friend. I think Instagram, Chris Harman RTB is my handle. I I started a Twitter. I have a Twitter. I don't use it because Twitter's just a nightmare of a hellscape. So I don't use that. But I think the best places to get in touch with me would be Facebook, Instagram. My email address for the podcast is just redrawingthebath@gmail.com.
Oh, nice.
So I mean, yeah, I'd love to have contact with some people and just they want to pick my brain, call me a heretic. You know, I'm really.
We
good
didn't
with
do that once.
No, you
I'm
didn't.
so proud of us.
I would have
I
been.
actually don't think you are a heretic, but
No.
also I didn't say it on live.
Honestly,
radio,
it wouldn't have
but
been like as a joke. Seriously, I'd been like, okay, like that's to quote.
I'm
the
sure there's
movie,
people that think I'm a heretic too, so we'll
Yeah.
be in that club together. But
everybody's somebody's heretic.
for anyone, if you've listened to this and you've been fascinated by it or you have more questions, please come to the event on August 10th. And then, of course, if you want to know anything about Theology on Tap or Theology on Air, we encourage you to go to houstontot.com. That's where you can find all the information about everything in the whole world. No, I'm kidding, but definitely about Theology on Tap, houstontot.com. And until we talk to you guys next time or engage in these kinds of things, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.